Good evening, and welcome to the Cabinets of Fever Dreams. Tonight's a tale of home, love, and infidelity. My Wife Won't Stop Licking the Walls of Our New Apartment is read to you tonight by Sam Barlien with musical backing by Petar Mrdjen. If you want to give the YouTube algorithm a nudge so it recommends this channel to more people, please like the video and comment lick. Also, if you'd like to hear more of these stories early and help me keep a roof over my head, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. All your support is greatly appreciated. With all that said, take a seat and stay away from the walls. They have a life of their own.
She touches the walls the same way she once touched me. Gently. Her fingers barely hovering over the plaster, letting the mere suggestion of her caress do all the work. She touches the walls of the apartment the same way she touched me. And I fear our marriage has reached a point of no return. It didn't take long for me to notice her strange behavior. From the day we moved into the apartment, my wife developed a habit of running her fingers along the walls as if our home were a long-lost lover. At first, I thought she was simply excited to live an existence free of landlords. But as the days went on, her attachment to the apartment became unavoidable. Every chance she would get, she would press her body against the walls. Whenever we'd talk, be it in the living room or bedroom or kitchen, one of her hands was always caressing the third silent member of the conversation. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd find her sneaking a lick. I thought our marriage was rock solid. I thought we'd get a dog and raise children and grow old together. I was certain. People in happy marriages, however, seldom end up in this dark corner of the internet. We'd moved to Prague because of my work. I initially had a couple of cities in Europe to choose from, but the moment I mentioned Prague, my wife insisted the choice had already been made. She'd spent 4 years studying in the city for her bachelor's and 2 years of our marriage insisting we go visit. I didn't argue. The city seemed nice enough. Once I accepted the position and we started going through the process of getting our visas, my wife took the reins of decision-making once more. If we were to move to another city permanently, she said, we should invest in buying an apartment. She was always very iffy on the idea of starting a family and settling down. But the moment the city of Prague entered the equation, her vagueness dissipated. I was pleased with this development, and I'd done rather well for myself financially, so I let her find us a place. The apartment she bought was wholly different from what I expected. When I Googled neighborhoods in Prague, I expected us to end up in the Parisian houses that made up much of the heart of the city. I expected parks, cafes, restaurants, and bars that used to be barracks or churches once upon a time. I expected culture. What I got instead was communist outskirts. The apartment my wife had purchased was on the edge of one of the subway lines and was located on the 4th floor of a sea of cement. The apartment had low ceilings from which we could clearly hear our neighbors, but all in all, it wasn't terrible. A spacious bedroom, a comfortable living room, a kitchen with everything the stomach could desire, and a living room big enough to host guests. The apartment itself wasn't strange. Not in the beginning, at least. What confused me was the location. We were miles away from any hint of culture. The air, it smelled vaguely of dog food, and the only real restaurant dining option was the pizza stand in the subway that was staffed exclusively by people who looked like they should be on suicide watch. For the life of me, I couldn't understand. Why? Why had my wife chosen that particular apartment in that particular corner of the city? Any reservations I'd had about our new home, however, were undone by my wife's sheer excitement at being in the new apartment. When we first got past the front door, she made multiple rounds around it, running her fingers along the walls all along the way. When she'd finally finished touring, She collapsed on an old couch the previous owners had left behind, and regarded the plain white ceiling as if it was a fresco painted by the masters. That night, when we first made love in our new home, she refused to do so in bed. Instead, she pressed herself up against the walls of the old communist-era home. Her request was queer, but I was far too caught up in the action to question it. As the days went on, however, I would find myself thinking back to that night over and over again. My wife has always had very strong opinions about aesthetics. But when it came time to furnish our new home, she left the task entirely up to me. She wouldn't leave the house. Whenever I came back from my IKEA trips, I would find her standing at the front door, waiting for me, slightly out of breath. It was as if the sound of my key in the door had disturbed her from whatever she was doing prior to my arrival. The way she would caress the walls bothered me. But whenever I tried formulating my discomfort into words, I would just end up feeling insane. She said she was simply excited to be back in Prague. She said she simply liked the apartment. After my first couple attempts to broach the subject, I remained silent. Then, I found her licking the walls. We were curled up on the couch, watching a movie, when she got up and left. I figured she went to the bathroom, so I didn't make much of her absence. When she didn't return for a solid 20 minutes, I went to search for her. I found her in our bedroom. She was licking the wall. When I caught her, she denied it. She said she wasn't doing anything strange and that I was simply inventing things. When I pointed to the wet spot on the wall where her tongue had just been seconds prior, my wife finally acquiesced. She said she wasn't licking the wall. She was simply smelling it, and her tongue must have slipped. When I asked her why she'd be smelling the wall of the apartment, she shrugged and said that the wall had a peculiar smell. It did. It smelled ever so gently of sweat. I tried theorizing about why the wall of our apartment would smell that way, but my wife refused to engage in the debate. She said she wanted to finish watching the movie. So we did. That night, as we fell asleep, I could still see the wet patch of wall next to our bed. The room was dark, and the patch had dried considerably by then, but I was certain that I could see it. As I stared at the dark patch of wall, I started to get a feeling that it was shifting around. But I pushed those thoughts to the back of my brain. I convinced myself that there was nothing wrong with the apartment. I convinced myself I had nothing to worry about. Later in the week, my wife went drinking with her university friends and made me join her. I didn't protest. Her strange affection towards the apartment was getting increasingly difficult to ignore, and spending some time outside seemed like the perfect antidote. We ended up at a rooftop bar, not far from the old town. We were far too high above the city to see the crowds of tourists, and all we were left with was the Gothic city. It was much closer to the visage of Prague that Google had painted for me. Questions about why my wife would insist on living in communist architecture swirled through my head, but the alcohol soon washed them out. My wife's friends seemed genuinely surprised at first. I apparently wasn't the sort of type my wife went for in university. It seemed to be a pleasant surprise. But as the night went on, her friends kept asking strange questions. Did I really have no interest in the occult? Was I really working a full-time stable job? Did I ever try any sacrificial magic? I laughed all the questions off, but my wife didn't find them funny. She still has her collection of crystals that I'm not allowed to touch, but back in university, my wife was a big mysticism nerd. When she talked about that time, it sounded like it mainly involved reading obscure literature and going on camping trips to supposedly haunted places. Once, About a year ago, when she drank a bit too much, my wife admitted to once being part of a sacrificial circle that dispatched a chicken. But aside from a little spilt blood, her ventures into the occult seemed wholly innocent. Look, dead chicken or not, whenever we talked about the more mystical time of her life, my wife seemed to be over it. It seemed more like a gathering of funny anecdotes than something she was still passionate about. That night, on the rooftop bar, my wife seemed to take her ancient interest in the occult deadly serious. Every joke at her expense, or more accurately, at the expense of her past lovers, seemed to irritate her further and further, until finally she stood up from the table and announced she'd forgotten something in the apartment and had to go retrieve it. Well, I offered to come with her, but she insisted I stay. The apartment, after all, was just a brisk 20-minute subway ride away. She would be back momentarily. I didn't want to start a fight, especially not in public, so I relented. I stayed on the rooftop bar with her friends, and I waited for my wife to come back. She didn't. She didn't pick up her phone, she didn't answer any of my messages, and once 2 hours had passed and we were all sufficiently buzzed, it became very clear she wasn't coming back. I left the bar with one of her friends, Yana, if my memory serves me correct. We were both heading towards the subway to make our way home. Yana seemed nice enough and wasn't as hung up on the whole cult thing as the rest of the group. When I told her which subway station our apartment was on, all the color drained out of her face.
That's where Botovoy used to live,
she said.
They dated for a couple of years. A very stormy relationship. He was deep into the whole cult and demon and ghost thing.
The fact that I could not even pronounce the man's name got under my skin. But I was considerably more uncomfortable when Yana asked for my address. When I told her, she audibly gasped.
That was Botovoy's address,
she said.
That's where he died.
I tried getting more information out of Yana, but by then my train had arrived and I was anxious to get back to my wife. The whole ride through, I kept my eyes glued to the windows of the subway. Past the ever-repeating mess of wires and metals, I could see the reflection of my own face. I looked miserable. When I entered the apartment, I found her waiting for me in the hallway. There was sweat above her brow. Her bathrobe was beyond revealing, and the door to our bedroom was left ajar. She was also holding a lit cigarette, even though she quit when we first started dating. I focused on that. My mind was filled with thoughts of a dead man whose name I couldn't pronounce, and the scent of sweat from the walls made me dizzy, but I focused on the cigarette. She said coming back to her old stomping grounds had made her miss old habits. She offered me a cigarette, and I took it. I'm not a smoker, but I was shaken and tipsy enough to appreciate the hit of nicotine. There was a half-drank bottle of Jack in the living room that had not been there when we left the house. Next to it sat an ashtray filled with a dozen dead cigarette butts. The thought of my wife having company in the apartment while I was gone tugged at the back of my skull, but I asked a more pressing question. I asked about the man whose name I couldn't pronounce. Hearing those foreign sounds come out of her mouth without a hint of effort felt like an ice pick to the throat. My wife seemed reluctant to talk about her old fling at first, but when I kept insisting, she finally opened up. Yes, her and this Botovoy dated back in university. Yes, he too had an interest in the occult. No, I had nothing to worry about. He was dead. When I asked about the nature of his death, she tried changing the topic of conversation again. She poured me a drink. She cuddled me. She insisted that now was not the time to talk about death. I refused to let go of the question. I wanted to know how he died. I wanted to know where he died. My insistence on the precise location of his death took all the flirt out of her eyes. She poured herself another drink, thought for a while, and then started to speak about her ex. She spoke slowly, and even though she was far from sober, she chose her words with surgical precision. As I was well aware, she was no longer interested in the occult. She'd moved on from the Eldritch shortly after leaving university and entering the job market. She had lost contact with this Bory Voy character, and she had not thought about him for years, but supposedly he remained deeply tied to various cult societies. She had found out, very recently, just about a week or two ago, that he had died in a sacrificial ritual. I asked my wife again, where he died. She was not aware this Beaurevoy was dead when she bought the apartment. She simply remembered Prague 13 being a nice, peaceful neighborhood where one might raise kids. That's why she chose this apartment. Her ex's death would have nothing to do with it. It would be crazy to even suggest that. In retrospect, her answers brought up more questions than they answered. But on that couch, in that moment, with all the alcohol in my blood, I was satiated by her words. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Everything seemed to be okay. Suddenly, any prospect of infidelity seemed to be only a product of my neuroticism. I was just happy to be spending a nice evening with my wife. We drank, we laughed, we drank some more. My wife took me to bed, and in the morning I woke up in her sweet embrace. My tolerance for drink isn't very strong. When I woke up, my body felt horrible. But aside from the rough hangover, I was happy. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom to wash out my mouth that panic seized me. In my sink, floating on the bubbles of draining Listerine, sat bits of plaster. I rinsed again and found even more plaster. The memories hit me like a brick. Vague visions of drunken love intermingled with terror. I could remember my wife's familiar touch. I could remember her lips and long fingers and moans, but beyond all that, there was something else. There was something else in the room with us. Along with her gentle touch, I could recall something more coarse and cold traveling up my back. I could recall feeling like the walls were closing in on me, but beyond that, my memory refused to travel. The horrid implications of my drunken night chilled me to my core, but it wasn't until I went back to the bedroom that my sanity fully snapped. The walls. It was the walls that sent me running out the door of that cursed place. All across the bedroom, as if drawn by a petulant child, there were spots of wet. Like drunken polka dots, they covered the walls, and what was worse, what was considerably worse, they moved. The wet spots on the wall moved like the cells of some primordial organism. They moved in the rhythm of my sleeping wife's breath. I thought my marriage was rock solid. But turns out it's as brittle as drywall.